Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. Today's true crime case is going to be the case of Scottish serial killer Dennis Nilsen. He's actually really well known as the Scottish serial killer, the Muswell Hill murderer, or the Kindly killer. Now guys, this is quite a big case and there are a lot of details and victims that I wanted to let you guys know about. And when I actually researched this, I did find it really interesting. And I hope you do as well, that way you can find out all the details of this case. I'd just like to let you know that I don't mean any disrespect to anyone I'm going to speak about today. I've gathered the information off the internet and this video is for educational purposes. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born on the 23rd of November in 1945 in Fraserburgh, Aberdeenshire, Scotland. As a child, Dennis was really quiet, but he was very adventurous and he had such a close relationship with his grandfather. When it got to 1951, with declining health, his grandfather, who was a fisherman, went out to his work and he actually suffered a heart attack whilst he was out fishing in the North Sea, and as a result of this, he unfortunately passed away at the age of 62. Now, Dennis, as a young child at the time, would go on to see his grandfather's body. And I do think this did have quite an effect on Dennis. I do think it was quite pinnacle in his life and throughout this case, and you will find out why as the more we get into it. In the years that followed, Dennis kind of became very withdrawn and very quiet. He would often stand out on the harbour and watch the boats while they worked, and he kind of seemed to recoil from any affection that his parents would give to him. Eventually, he actually began to resent how much affection his siblings were receiving from his parents. And like I said, they tried to show this affection to him also, but he just wouldn't have it. He just recoiled from it. As he began to hit puberty, he actually realised that he was homosexual. And this initially made him feel ashamed and confused. When he reached 14, he joined the Army Cadet Force and he went on to serve in the military for 11 years, and eventually he found himself living in London. By late 1978, Dennis was living a solitary existence. With having at least 3 failed previous relationships in 18 months, he would later confess that he felt that he was pretty much unfit to be lived with. Throughout 1978, he devoted his time and effort into his work. And most evenings he spent drinking and listening to his music. Dennis would go on to murder at least 12 young men and boys between 1978 and 1983 in London. 195 Melrose Avenue. It was on the 30th of December in 1978 that Dennis would claim his first victim. And this would actually be Stephen Holmes. Basically, Dennis came across Stephen whilst drinking in the Cricklewood Arms pub. According to Dennis, he'd been drinking heavily all day after deciding earlier on that he needed to go out and get out of his flat so that he could seek some company. Stephen was in the pub trying to buy alcohol and he was only 14-year-old, so nobody would actually serve him. So Dennis invited him round to his flat with the promise of music, of alcohol, and that's what Stephen was trying to get, so he decided that he would go. And Dennis actually said that he thought Stephen was 17 years old at the time. They both drank until they passed out. The next day, Dennis decided that he wanted Stephen to stay with him until New Year, whether he wanted to or not. And that was when he went and got a necktie and strangled Stephen until he was unconscious. Whilst he was doing this, he was actually straddling him at the same time. He then went and got a bucket, he filled it with water, and he actually drowned Stephen. He went on to take the body to his bathtub and washed him before placing him on the bed and gaining sexual gratification from this. When rigor mortis eventually passed, he decided to put the body underneath the floorboards, and this is where he would remain for around about 8 months before he actually burned his body on the 11th of August in 1979. On the 11th of October 1979, Dennis actually attempted to murder a student. Andrew Ho, a student from Hong Kong, had actually met Dennis at a pub and he was lured back to his flat with the promise of sex. This is where Dennis tried to strangle Andrew, but Andrew actually managed to get away and he did contact the police. They of course questioned Dennis about this, and then Andrew decided that he didn't actually want to press charges and the whole thing was dropped. Now let me just say that it's a real shame looking back at this, because Possibly if charges were filed at the time, then maybe some of these victims that Dennis actually claimed may have been spared. But hindsight is 2020. Andrew wasn't to know that Dennis would turn into an infamous serial killer. Just 2 months later, on the 3rd of December 1979, Dennis came across Kenneth Ockenden, a 23-year-old Canadian student who was on a tour of England and was visiting relatives. So they both met after drinking in a West End pub, and after Dennis found out he was a tourist, he told him that he would go and show him the sights. He would go and show him all the main attractions of London, and at the time, of course, Kenneth probably would have thought this was a fantastic idea. He was there to go and see England and go and see the sights, so why would this not be a great idea? Unfortunately, this wasn't the case. He did as he said, and he did show him the landmarks, granted, but he then lured him back to his flat with the promise of a meal and more drinks. Dennis actually ended up strangling Kenneth with his own headphone cord as he listened to music. He then poured himself a glass of rum, took the headphone cord that he'd moments ago used to strangle Kenneth, and continued to listen to music. The next day, he went and bought a Polaroid camera and photographed Kenneth's body in certain suggestive positions. He then lay his body with his arms and legs outstretched above him while he watched TV for several hours. He then proceeded to wrap the body in plastic bags and then placed him under his floorboards. And over the next fortnight, he would actually go back and pull out the corpse and actually seat him in the armchair beside him while he watched telly and drank. And I think this happened around about 4 times. As you can already tell, Dennis was a very, very disturbed man. On the 17th of May in 1980, Dennis claimed his 3rd victim. Martin Duffy was a 16-year-old catering student who had actually hitchhiked from Birkenhead to London without even telling his parents. After sleeping rough for 4 days, he was so happy to accept Dennis's offer of a meal and a bed. Dennis said that Martin looked hungry and exhausted, and he fell asleep in his bed straight away. Dennis trapped his arms under the covers, sat on his chest, and used great force to strangle him. He then dragged him unconscious into the kitchen and drowned him in his sink. Like previously, he then went and had a bath with the body, and he actually described this body as the youngest body he'd ever seen. Dennis placed the body on a chair in the kitchen and then onto his bed. He kissed and caressed the body again, sexually gratifying himself. He then put the body in a cupboard for the next 2 weeks, and it was only when it started to show signs of bloating that he then did put it under the floorboards. After Martin's murder, he did begin to commit crimes a lot more often. And by the end of 1980, he'd actually tried to kill 5 people and attempted to murder another. And one of the really sad things was that most of these people were never even identified. So no one knows whether these people were their own family or anything like that, because Dennis's recollection of these people was vague. Only one of these victims would actually be identified, and that was William David Sutherland, who was 27 years old. William actually slept with men for money, and Dennis said that he didn't even want to take him home that night, but William just followed him anyway. Dennis apparently woke up the next morning next to his body, and he barely remembered strangling him. Although he didn't really recall who these men were, he did recall in graphic detail the ways in which he had actually killed them. He knew how long he'd kept the bodies for before dismembering them. Of course, as time passed and as he kept adding to his collection of his murder victims under his floorboards, with decomposition setting in, the bodies did begin to attract some unwanted attention. They began to smell. Rodents and insects would infest themselves in them. He even said that he would go and look down and the bodies were covered in maggots, and they were crawling out of, well, basically everywhere, and it was just disgusting. He even tried to hide the smells by spraying scents, and even used insecticide to try and kill off the insects and things before they actually could lay the larvae. But these really had little to no effect, and in late 1980s he took out all of the bodies from under his floorboards, dismembered them before burning them on a wasteland behind his flat. He even used a car tyre to disguise the smell of rotting flesh. 3 neighbourhood children would stand by and actually watch this campfire. And little did they know what they were actually witnessing, which is horrific to even think about. When the fire had burnt out, he went and checked the remains, and he scoured through to see whether there were anything left over, basically. And he did recall finding a skull, which he then went to smash up into tiny little pieces with his rake to make it unrecognisable, make sure there was nothing distinguishable in this fire. Around about the 4th of January in 1981, he came across an 18-year-old, blue-eyed young Scot, as he described him. He strangled him with a tie and put him under his floorboards. On the 12th of January, he even went ahead and informed his employers that he was unable to attend work that day due to being ill, when in fact he was actually at home dismembering this victim along with another one that he had killed around about a month prior to that. Then by April, he had killed another 2 unidentified victims. One was described by Dennis himself as an English skinhead, and the other as a Belfast boy in his early 20s. Speaking later with relation to these 3 people he'd killed, he casually reflected back. End of the day, end of the drink, end of a person, floorboards back, carpet replaced, and back to work at Denmark Street. He just had no remorse or anything for what he'd done, basically. He would carry out one final murder at Melrose Avenue, and this would be 24-year-old Malcolm Barlow. Malcolm was actually an orphan and suffered from mental health issues. So I found this one very strange. Get this, he actually found Malcolm loitering outside his house on the 17th of September 1981. Basically, Malcolm told Dennis that he had meds for his epilepsy which made him feel weak. And at the time he felt very ill, so Dennis actually helped to walk him back to where he lived, and he phoned for an ambulance for him. The next day, apparently, Malcolm went round to thank Dennis for his help. They had food, they had drinks, and Malcolm fell asleep. Dennis then went on to strangle him with his bare hands, and he went and put his body below his kitchen sink the following morning. So he actually supported this man. He went and took him and got the help and the care that he needed, and this man came around the next day to thank him, and then he killed him. It's just unbelievable. Why didn't he just simply strangle him when he found him, when he was weak off his meds and whatnot? I feel like it was a power thing, but I did actually find out later on that Dennis actually said that Malcolm's presence started to annoy him, and so he strangled him. Dennis also did things that I found really disturbing to actually get rid of his victims' bodies and body parts whilst at Melrose Avenue. So what I've found is that he would actually boil people's heads, their hands and their feet, in order to remove the flesh from these sections. And I think it would basically just leave you with the bones then eventually. I don't even like to think about something like that. It's pretty disturbing and disgusting. Okay, moving on. Dennis's landlord actually wanted to do up the property that Dennis was staying in, and he offered him £1,000 to actually leave, which Dennis, reluctant at first, did eventually accept. The day before he moved out, he went on to dismember the final body of his latest victim, and in fact, he had actually dismembered the bodies of the other 4 in January and August. He went on to burn them like with before, again using the tyre to try and disguise the smell. On the 5th of October 1981, he moved into an attic flat, 23D Kremlin Gardens, in the Muswell Hill district of North London. And it was here that he actually didn't have access to a garden. He was unable to follow his previous routine. He was up in the attic, so he didn't really have the floorboards to enable him to use them to hide bodies like he had previously. And I think, like, for this reason, for the next 2 months, the people that he lured back to his flat were not murdered. On one occasion, he did actually attempt to strangle a 19-year-old student called Paul Nobbs while he was asleep in November, but he did actually manage to stop himself. Paul actually woke up to find a thin red line on his neck, he had bruising, and he had bloodshot eyes. Dennis told him he should go to a doctor. He actually went to the university infirmary, and this is when they told him that it looked like he'd been strangled. He did report this to the police, but basically they put it down to homosexual encounter where both parties had actually just been super drunk. There was also another encounter. Now, if I pronounce this wrong, I apologise, but I will give it my best shot. Toshimitsu Ozawa. and he went round to Dennis's flat on New Year's Eve. He was later seen coming down the steps sobbing before rushing away. He told police that Dennis had actually come towards him with a tie outstretched between both hands. There was no follow-up investigation. 23 Kremlin Gardens. In March of 1982, Dennis came across John Howlett while drinking near Leicester Square. Dennis basically promised him the continuation of the drinking session. They watched a film before he proceeded to get onto Dennis's bed. He asked him to leave, but John flat out refused. And so, well, Dennis decided to kill him. Now, John actually did manage to fight back, and he actually attempted to strangle Dennis himself, but he unfortunately lost the battle when he was struck on the head. Dennis then was quite actually shaken, and he went and got an upholstery strap to try and strangle John, but he was actually still alive. Over the next 10 minutes, he would try to kill him without success. He was very shaken. He had actually almost been strangled himself, so he was very, very upset about this, and that might be why his attempts failed. As a result of this, he decided to fill his bathtub and drown him instead. And for over a week, he would bear the bruises as to where his victim had actually tried to fight back. In May 1982, he came across 21-year-old Carl Stotter, who again he invited back to his flat. They drank a hell of a lot, and Carl actually fell asleep on top of an open sleeping bag. He awoke to find himself being strangled by Dennis, and in his kind of dazed, delusional state, he actually thought Dennis was trying to help him. Dennis then took him to the bathroom and again filled up his bathtub, and this is where he attempted to drown him. Carl did actually manage to get his head above the water and pleaded with Dennis to stop. He actually said, "No more please, no more," before Dennis submerged his head once more. He actually thought that he had killed Carl, so he went and put him in the armchair, and it wasn't actually until his dog, Bleep, started licking his face that Dennis realised Carl was still alive. When Carl actually came to, Dennis went on to tell him that it was actually the sleeping bag that was strangling him. And of course, Dennis was trying to help him. He then ran him a cold bath because Carl was in shock. He attributed it to being a nightmare. Carl did seek medical attention, and they of course told him it was consistent with severe strangulation. He did make a date to meet Dennis again because Dennis did want to meet him again, but he never actually showed, which was probably for the best because it probably did save his life. And he never did report that to the police. In June 1982, Dennis was promoted in his job. He was promoted to executive officer. And then 3 months on from this, he met a man called Graham Allen whilst he was hailing a taxi. The pair travelled together for a meal to Kremlin Gardens, and Dennis recalls making him an omelette. He didn't really recall the exact moment that he did actually strangle Graham, but he did remember approaching him whilst he was eating this omelette with the intent to kill. And the way in which he recalled his death was so strange. He actually said that he suddenly noticed him just sitting there and he appeared to be asleep or unconscious, with a large piece of omelette hanging out of his mouth. And it was that point that he thought he had strangled him, but again he didn't remember doing so. He thought that possibly the man had choked on the egg. He said, "If the omelette killed him, I don't know." But since an omelette doesn't leave a red mark on a person's neck, he did suppose that he was the person responsible. He went on to store his body in his bathtub for 3 days before dismembering his body on the kitchen floor. Once again, he informed his employers that he was ill that day just so that he could carry out the job. On the 26th of January 1983, Dennis would claim his final victim. 20-year-old Stephen Sinclair was last seen by friends walking towards the tube with Dennis. At Dennis's flat, Stephen fell asleep in the armchair due to the pure amount of alcohol and drugs that he'd consumed. Dennis went into the kitchen to gather some thick string, and this string was actually not long enough, so he did tie it to a tie. And he recalled saying to him, "Oh Stephen, here we go again." And then he strangled him. Dennis actually said that he contemplated all of the pain that was in Stephen's life, and he decided to end it for him. He found bandages on either side of Stephen's wrist, which were covering up attempts that Stephen had actually taken on his own life. He bathed the body, applied talcum powder. He then went on to perform some strange acts before he fell asleep next to the body. He dismembered the body, wrapped them in plastic bags, and stored them in a wardrobe, a tea chest, even in a drawer below his bathtub. And the bags were actually sealed using the same bandages that Stephen had around his wrists. Now, Dennis actually tried to dispose of the flesh, organs, and the smaller bones of the 3 victims killed at Kremlin Gardens by none other than flushing them down his toilet. It was on the 4th of February that Dennis even wrote a letter of complaint to the estate agents saying that the drains were blocked and that it was very uncomfortable for him and the other tenants that were living there. And what may have been blocking the drains, you ask? Well, yes. On the 8th of February, a Dino Red employee, Michael Catran, opened a drain cover at the side of the house, and he found that the entire pipe was covered with a flesh-like substance, and even some small bones were inside. And I seriously can't believe that he actually tried to flush them down the toilet. I don't know how, but I just don't understand it at all. Did he not think that it would block up the drains? I just don't know. But anyway, the drain company had a meeting with Dennis and another tenant. And this is when they told them what the source of the blockage looked like. And Dennis's response was, "It looks to me like someone's been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken." I do wonder whether he actually pre-thought of that as a response or whether it was just kind of a quick off-the-mark thing. Because that would have been a pretty good explanation if the real reason wasn't the fact that Dennis had been flushing down body parts and flesh down his own toilet. At 7:30 a.m. the next morning, the workmen came to the drains, and these had been mysteriously cleared. There was no longer a blockage, and most of the fleshy substance was gone. They did actually find a few scraps of flesh and small bones in the pipe leading up to the top of the house, and these bones that they found looked like they were from a human hand. They immediately called the police. They later found more flesh and more bones, and this was taken to the mortuary, where they were informed that these were in fact human remains. And they even did find a piece of flesh that they said was from the human neck, and it actually had ligature marks on it. The police waited for Dennis to return home from work, and they went up to his flat to discuss the drains. And the moment they walked through the door, they could instantly smell rotting flesh. Dennis, of course, asked, "Why are you interested in my drains?" They told him that they had found human remains in the drains, and Dennis actually pretended to be bewildered and shocked by this. One police officer actually said, "Don't mess about, where's the rest of the body?" Dennis was very calm and collected, and he informed them that they would find 2 plastic bags in a wardrobe, and this actually was where the horrible smell was coming from. The officers didn't actually open the cupboard, but they did ask Dennis if there were any other body parts. And he replied, "It's a long story, it goes back a long time. I'll tell you everything. I want to get it off my chest, not here at the police station." He was of course arrested and cautioned on suspicion of murder, before being taken to Hornsey police station. As he was actually on his way to the police station, Dennis was asked if the remains in his flat belonged to one person or 2. Staring out of the window of the police car, he replied, 15 or 16 since 1978. And I can imagine that the policeman that day probably was gobsmacked. He thought it was 1 or 2 bodies. He would have never expected Dennis to say 15 or 16. When the contents of the wardrobe were removed, they found that it contained 2 dissected torsos and a shopping bag, which contained various internal organs. The second bag contained a human skull with literally no flesh on it, a severed head, a torso with arms but no hands, and both of the heads had been subjected to moist heat. In an interview on the 10th of February, Dennis Nilsen confessed to the murder of 15 or 16 men across both addresses, and that he tried to kill a further 7 more. They searched the property further on this day and found out that there were more body parts stored in different locations. He accompanied them to Melrose Avenue, his previous address, and he actually pointed out the places in which he had the fires and where he'd burnt the bodies. And like I said, there were 3 fires, and they actually found over 1,000 blackened bone fragments within these 3 fires. So the police had 48 hours to charge or release him. So they were on a bit of a rush of this. The remains were collected and they did actually manage to pull a fingerprint off one of them, which they confirmed to be Stephen Sinclair. And so Dennis was charged for his murder. He would actually be interviewed for over 30 hours in the following days. Dennis was unsure of his motive of killing all of these people, and he simply replied, "I'm hoping you'll tell me that." He was, however, adamant that the decision he made to kill them was made just moments before he actually did kill them. And at the beginning of this case, if you remember, I did mention that him seeing his grandfather's body after he's passed, that it would be important later on. Well, this is an extract from Dennis's prison journal, which he wrote whilst he was on remand in 1983. Dennis did some very strange things to these bodies once he'd actually killed them, such as shaving them, applying them with makeup, and some sexual aspects, which I don't really want to go into the details of because it can be quite disturbing. But he did actually state that his victims were too beautiful for the pathetic ritual of commonplace sex. He would marvel at the beauty of these bodies as he propped them up in his armchair or on his bed. When questioned as to why the heads found at Kremlin Gardens had been subjected to the moist heat, Dennis stated that he had frequently boiled the heads of his victims in a large cooking pot on his own stove in his own kitchen in order that the internal contents evaporated. This removed the need to dispose of things like the brains and the flesh. He then flushed organs and small bones down the toilet, as in his eyes, this was the only method that he could think of, since he didn't actually have a garden to burn them in. On the 11th of February 1983, Dennis Nilsen was officially charged with the murder of Stephen Sinclair. He was taken to Brixton Prison, where he would be held until his trial. Dennis was brought on trial on the 24th of October and was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder. Dennis did actually give a not guilty plea for each charge. And following a large trial which included testimonies from numerous people, from psychologists, amongst many others, the jury on the 4th of November 1983 came back with a majority vote of guilty on all charges. He was charged to life imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years. His sentence was later upgraded to a whole life tariff. And whilst in prison, Dennis did actually write prison journals, and he did things like autobiographies. He did a lot of written things that you guys can go and check out if you wish to. And the actual true total of his victims is kind of speculated. So he did describe at least 15 victims, and this was described in detail within his 30 hours of questioning. And their appearance never faltered, things never changed. So it goes to believe that this was actually the true number. But in 1992, Dennis actually claimed that the number was only 12 and the other 3 had been simply made up. Now, the interviewing detective does disagree with this. Again, he was there, he witnessed his descriptions of these men, and he does actually believe that the true total was at least 15. On the 10th of May 2018, Dennis Nilsen was taken from prison to the hospital complaining of severe stomach pains. He was actually found to have suffered an abdominal aortic aneurysm. And for those of you who don't know what that is, the aorta, which comes down from the heart, is a very, very big vessel. And the force that it pumps through is quite strong. So when your arteries and things gather plaque on them, they usually block up, but because of the sheer amount of blood flow going down this, it doesn't block up, so it kind of pushes out the vessel instead where the plaque is, creating a bulge. And this bulge weakens the vessel, and it slowly grows and grows and grows, and eventually when it gets to a certain size, it does eventually rupture. And this condition can be seriously life-threatening. If they don't operate quickly, they bleed out rapidly. Now, the surgery with Dennis was actually a success, but he did suffer a blood clot which was a complication of the surgery, and he actually passed away on the 12th of May. He was 72-year-old at the time and had served 34 years into his life sentence. I really did find this case interesting, disturbing, and just unbelievable all at the same time. And I can't believe that this man was only caught at the time because he had flushed down human remains down his own toilet. But how many more victims would he have claimed if he hadn't been caught that day? I do think Dennis was a man that suffered from huge mental health issues, and the way in which he murdered so callously without empathy, or the fact that he had no remorse, it just goes to show that he was a very, very disturbed man. I really do hope that you guys found this as interesting as I did, and I thank you for if you've stuck with me for this long. I do know it's a bit longer than my normal videos, but this was a serial killer case and he did have a lot of victims, so there was a lot of information. Please let me know if you'd like me to look into any of your cases. If you have any ideas, give them in the comments below and I'll look into them for you. If you'd like to subscribe or to my channel or like this video, please do so. Okay guys, that's all I have today on the serial killer Dennis Nilsen. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye!